In 1981, an 8-year-old boy vanished during a sunny church potluck in rural Georgia. 11 years later, a blue plastic Tupperware bin is opened in the church basement, uncovering a child's drawing, a single sneaker, and the dark secret the town buried to protect its own. The summer sun cast long golden beams over the rolling hills of McKinley, Georgia, as families gathered outside the small white clapboard church for the annual potluck. The folding tables sagged under bowls of coleslaw, plates of fried chicken, and peach cobbler still warm from the oven. Kids darted between the legs of grown-ups, their laughter rising above the gospel music playing faintly through the speakers rigged near the sanctuary steps. It was a perfect Sunday, the kind people looked back on and called simpler times. Carol Wilkes kept glancing up from her casserole dish, eyes scanning the yard for her son. Tommy had begged her for one more scoop of banana pudding and then vanished into the sea of children, somewhere near the tree line where the woods curved around the back of the church. It wasn't unusual for kids to wander off together, chasing frogs or trading baseball cards, but this time something felt off. A creeping sense of unease settled into her chest when she realized it had been nearly 20 minutes. She called his name once, then again louder. A few other mothers paused, watching her with polite curiosity. "He's probably just hiding," someone offered gently, but the tremble in Carol's voice betrayed something deeper. As the minutes stretched, that quiet concern turned into alarm. Parents began checking behind cars and under tables. Deacons spread out toward the edge of the woods. Tommy's name echoed through the pines as dusk began to fall. By nightfall, floodlights had been wheeled in from town. Flashlights cut through the trees, voices barked orders, and dogs sniffed through underbrush. Sheriff's deputies took statements. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through the creek bed behind the sanctuary. But there was nothing. No torn shirt, no shoes, no sign of a struggle. Just the last paper plate he'd been holding, tossed in the grass beneath a swing set. In the weeks that followed, the flyers multiplied, then faded. The search parties thinned. Summer turned to fall, and whispers of theories took root. Some said he'd wandered too far and drowned. Others hinted at something darker. But the truth stayed buried. That is, until 11 years later, when a janitor pried open a forgotten blue plastic Tupperware bin in the basement of the same church and found something that would change everything. The basement had always been the forgotten part of McKinley Baptist Church. Damp, dusty, and dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, it was used mostly for storing outdated hymnals, broken folding chairs, and leftover decorations from long-past holiday events. Few people ventured down there unless they had to, and even fewer stayed longer than a few minutes. After decades of clutter, Pastor Raines finally gave the order to clear it out. The church was planning renovations for the upcoming centennial, and the basement needed to be emptied for construction crews. Jerry, the part-time janitor and handyman, was the one stuck with the job. He had worked around the church for years, mostly unnoticed, mostly silent. He was sweeping near the far wall when he noticed something wedged behind a shelf that hadn't been moved in over a decade. It was a blue plastic Tupperware bin, caked in dust and sealed tight. There were no labels, no markings, just a faint, musty smell that clung to it as he pulled it into the light. He hesitated. The lid was stubborn, sealed by time and humidity, but with a flathead screwdriver and some effort, it finally popped free. Inside, he expected to find old Sunday school supplies or maybe forgotten kitchenware. Instead, lying neatly on top was a folded piece of yellow construction paper, brittle and worn at the edges. He unfolded it slowly. It was a child's drawing stick figures in front of a church, a crooked sun in the corner, and in shaky crayon letters, the name Tommy W. scrawled at the bottom. Jerry's stomach turned. Beneath the paper, tucked beside a water-stained hymnal, was a single small sneaker. Faded blue canvas, Velcro strap, size too small for any child still alive today. Jerry stared at it, the shape of it, the innocence of it, and the terrible weight it carried. He remembered the name. Everyone in McKinley did. Tommy Wilkes, the boy who vanished during a church picnic and was never seen again. Jerry slowly sat back on the concrete floor, the bin beside him, the drawing in his lap. For the first time in over a decade, someone had stumbled onto a piece of a story that was never supposed to be found. Detective Marla Griggs had been fresh out of the academy when Tommy Wilkes vanished. Just 23, new to the county, and still unsure how to carry her badge without looking like she'd borrowed it. She remembered that summer clearly, the chaos, the questions, the way the town seemed to hold its breath for weeks and then, just as suddenly, exhale and move on. Not her. She kept Tommy's file in a drawer at home, revisiting it every few years like a wound that never healed right. Now, 11 years later, she was back inside McKinley Baptist, standing in the musty basement where the Tupperware bin had been found. The drawing and sneaker were already logged as evidence, carefully sealed in clear bags. She stared at them, through the plastic, heart heavy. The drawing looked exactly like a child should, joyful, uneven lines, and too many arms on one of the stick figures, but it had been buried in the dark alongside that tiny shoe, and something about that made her throat tighten. The church staff hovered nervously at the top of the basement steps, whispering in hushed tones. Most of them were too young to remember the potluck or Tommy himself, but the older ones cast quick, uneasy glances toward the corner where the bin had been found. Pastor Raines tried to be helpful, offering dates, names, old event logs, but Marla could see it in his face. This wasn't just surprise, this was dread. She took her time walking the room, noting the thick layer of dust on some boxes and the faint mildew scent curling up from the concrete. Everything down here felt forgotten, like time itself had settled and hardened over the space. She paused at the wall where the janitor said the bin had been wedged behind the shelving. There were scratch marks on the floor, small ones, near the baseboard, and a faint discoloration on the drywall, like something had been taped there once and peeled away. She pressed her hand to the cool surface, letting her fingers trace the outline of the stain. It didn't feel like a crime scene, not yet, but it felt like the beginning of something. And that meant the story wasn't finished after all. Carol Wilkes had long since stopped answering the phone on the first ring. Too many years of reporters, well-meaning neighbors, and strangers with theories had taught her to wait. So when it rang that Monday morning and she let it go to voicemail, she didn't expect anything different. But then she heard the name Detective Griggs, and the sound of it pulled her back to a place she had spent years trying not to revisit. She sat in silence for nearly an hour, after playing the message, staring at the old calendar still pinned to the fridge, the one that hadn't been flipped since March. When she finally returned the call, her voice was calm, measured, almost cold. Marla, on the other end, kept her tone gentle, careful not to rush. She explained about the Tupperware bin found in the church basement, about the drawing with Tommy's name, about the shoe. Carol didn't cry, she didn't shout. She simply asked, "Are you sure it was his?" Marla didn't answer right away. "It matches the pair listed in the original report. Blue canvas, Velcro strap, size 2. Same brand. We're having it tested." Carol drove to the station that afternoon, the first time she'd been inside since 1981. She sat across from Marla in the small interview room with the peeling paint and mismatched chairs. When the evidence bag was placed in front of her, she didn't touch it, she just looked. Her eyes stayed on the shoe for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady. "I bought these at the Ben Franklin in town. They were the last thing he picked out before Sunday school." Marla nodded, knowing there was nothing else to say in that moment. The air in the room felt too heavy, thick with memory and grief that had never really gone anywhere. Carol asked if she could keep the drawing. "Not the original, just a copy." Marla said yes. As Carol left the building, the sun hit her face in that exact way it used to when she'd stand on the church lawn, squinting to find Tommy in the crowd. Only now there was no crowd, just the echo of footsteps and the growing sense that something long buried was about to be pulled into the light. The news moved through McKinley slower than it used to. There was no front-page article yet, no formal statement from the church, just quiet murmurs that someone had reopened the Wilkes case. For the older folks who still remembered that summer in 1981, the memory stirred like dust from an old hymnal. Most said the same thing they'd been saying for years, that the whole thing was just tragic, that they'd done all they could. But some, the ones who had been closer to the church leadership back then, shifted uncomfortably in their pews that Sunday and avoided eye contact with Pastor Raines. Marla knew where she had to go next. She returned to the church, not to the basement this time, but to the office where old records were kept. The administrative assistant, a polite woman in her 40s, showed her to the filing cabinets stacked against the back wall. They were metal, squeaky, filled with a mix of birth records, donation logs, and Sunday school rolls that hadn't been touched in years. It didn't take long to find the Potluck roster from June 1981. Most of the names were still familiar: Carol Wilkes, Eli Dawson, Reverend Halbrook, the elders, the volunteers. A list of dishes people had signed up to bring, neat cursive handwriting now faded and yellowed. At the bottom of the page, someone had added a line in pencil, nearly rubbed out: "Storage key moved to office drawer, July 10. It was small, almost like a personal note, and not signed. Marla glanced around the office. The drawers had long since been cleaned out, most of the furniture replaced when the new pastor took over in the late 80s. Still, it was another thread. Something about that date stood out. She flipped through the church's old maintenance logs and found it July 10, 1981. The day the basement was sealed off for pest control concerns. No inspection record, no contractor invoice, just a single line logged by the building committee chair. She stared at it for a long time, her mind pulling together the timelines: the potluck, Tommy's disappearance, the sudden sealing of the basement. It wasn't proof, not yet. But it was enough to tell her someone had gone to quiet lengths to keep that space untouched. And it wasn't for termites. The blue plastic bin sat quietly on the evidence table, its lid resealed and tagged, its contents now cataloged by the forensics team down at County. Marla couldn't stop thinking about how ordinary it looked. Just a bin, the kind people used to pack up toys or Christmas decorations, the kind that might sit unnoticed in a basement for years without raising a single question. And yet, inside that container had been the first real trace of Tommy Wilkes since the day he vanished. She had the drawing scanned and enhanced. It revealed nothing hidden, no secret messages, just the same crude stick figures and that shaky crayon scrawl spelling out Tommy W. But there was something about the layout, something eerie in hindsight. 5 figures stood under the crooked sun, one smaller than the rest, slightly separated from the group. That little detail stuck with her, even if it meant nothing at all. The sneaker was sent to the lab for DNA analysis, though the odds after so many years were slim. Still, a technician swabbed carefully around the inner lining, hopeful for any trace of organic material. It was worn on one side, as if the boy who had worn it dragged his foot slightly when he walked. Marla remembered the details from the original report. Carol had said Tommy had a slight inward step on his right foot, something the pediatrician said he'd outgrow. She kept replaying the conversation with the janitor in her mind. Jerry had said the bin was wedged in behind an old metal shelf, not just shoved there, but almost tucked away deliberately. Dust had formed a ring around it, which meant it hadn't been moved in years. When she'd asked if he remembered ever seeing that bin before, he shook his head. He hadn't even been working at the church back in 1981. He said the shelving itself hadn't been shifted in over a decade, maybe longer. So someone had hidden it there, someone with a reason, and whoever that someone was, they had access to the church basement after the disappearance, possibly even during the investigation. That changed everything. It meant this wasn't just a child who wandered off. It meant someone had placed that bin exactly where they hoped no one would ever look. Word had started to spread, not from news cameras or press conferences, but from whispered conversations in grocery aisles and church parking lots. The Wilkes case was back. People didn't know much, just that something was found in the basement, something tied to the boy who had vanished all those years ago. The older generation grew quiet, while the younger ones, who had only heard the story in passing or through parents' cautionary tales, leaned in closer. Marla returned to the station late that evening and pulled the old case files from storage. The manila folders were yellowed and stiff, the pages brittle with time. She laid them out in order across her desk, starting with the missing persons report, then the original interviews, maps of the search grid, the tips that came in the weeks that followed, many of them scrawled in pen or smeared pencil. She paused at a page marked July 12, 1981. It was a statement from a volunteer who mentioned checking the church basement during the initial search. According to the report, it had been locked. That detail hadn't stood out back then. The assumption was that someone had the key and had checked it already. The building had been old even then, with half the locks barely working. But now, in light of the sealed-off bin, it took on a different weight. Marla flipped through the follow-up logs. There was no entry confirming the basement had ever been fully searched. She picked up the phone and called the only person still alive from the original search team who had been assigned to that area, Stan Boyd, now in his 70s and long retired from the sheriff's department. His voice on the other end was slower than she remembered, worn down by time, but still sharp. When she asked about the basement, there was a long pause. He said he remembered finding the door locked and being told by one of the church elders that it was just storage and not worth the trouble. "Which elder?" she asked. He was quiet again, then said, "Could have been Halbrook. He was the loudest one back then." Marla made a note. Reverend Halbrook. Resigned in late 1981. Moved south. No forwarding address listed. Something about all of it left her with a heavy, growing certainty. Someone hadn't just hidden the bin. They had carefully chosen what parts of the church were allowed to be searched and what parts were not. Marla spent the next morning combing through archived newspaper clippings at the McKinley Public Library. Most of the articles followed a predictable rhythm, hopeful headlines in the first days, rising community effort in the first week, then slow, uncomfortable silence as the case faded from the public eye. What struck her wasn't what was written, but what wasn't. There was no mention of the church basement, no photos of the interior, no quote from church leaders about the areas searched. It was as if the building itself had been treated with kid gloves, protected by a wall of polite omission. In one photograph taken during the second day of the search, Marla noticed a small group of people standing near the back of the church, close to the rear entrance where the basement steps led down. Among them was Reverend Halbrook, stiff-backed and unsmiling, a hand raised in mid-gesture as he spoke to a cluster of deputies. Her eyes were drawn to the doorway behind him. The door was closed. She leaned in, examining the photo more closely. Something about Halbrook's posture unsettled her. He wasn't comforting anyone. He wasn't helping. He looked like he was blocking the door, like someone determined to keep questions from going in the wrong direction. Marla made copies of the article and photograph, folded them carefully into her case binder, and left the library with the sharp edge of suspicion pressing deeper into her thoughts. Back at the station, she called the church office again and asked if they had any old floor plans or structural blueprints. The secretary hesitated, but said she'd check in the back room. An hour later, Marla was holding faded blueprints from 1979, rolled up and brittle, the corners yellowed with age. She spread them out on the break room table, anchoring the edges with coffee mugs and staplers. Her eyes followed the basement layout. Storage rooms, a boiler closet, an old maintenance corridor that hadn't been listed on any modern map. At the far end, she saw something peculiar, a narrow wall marked off in pencil with no label, no door, no explanation. She stared at it in silence. 11 years ago, a boy disappeared and a door had been locked. Now, she was looking at a space no one had remembered, no one had searched, and perhaps no one was ever meant to find. Carol Wilkes didn't go to the church anymore. She hadn't set foot inside since the month after Tommy disappeared, when the congregation started looking at her like a ghost. Some with pity, others with quiet suspicion, as if her sorrow made them uncomfortable. She found other places to pray, other places to breathe. But after Marla called again, she agreed to meet in the parking lot under the large oak tree where Tommy used to chase squirrels during Sunday school breaks. She stood with her arms crossed tightly, her gray hair pulled back in a simple twist. When Marla handed her the blueprint copy, Carol stared at it for a long time. She didn't say anything at first, just pointed to the end of the hall near the basement. "That's where the supply room used to be," she said softly. "The one with the squeaky light. It always smelled like dust and old paper." Marla nodded. "This wall section wasn't listed on any of the modern plans. I think it was covered up sometime in the early '80s, possibly just after the potluck." Carol's eyes didn't move from the page. "He wouldn't have gone down there on his own. He didn't like the dark. If he was scared, he'd come straight back to me. Every time." They stood in silence for a while, the wind moving gently through the leaves overhead. Marla wanted to offer comfort, but nothing felt right. This wasn't closure, not yet. It was only confirmation of something Carol had known in her bones since that night Tommy hadn't run away. He hadn't wandered off. Someone had taken steps to hide what had happened. Later that day, Marla returned to the church and walked the perimeter of the basement with the blueprint in hand. She counted off measurements, tapping the concrete walls until she found a section that sounded different, more hollow. The drywall there was newer than the rest. Not by much, but enough for a trained eye to spot. She pressed her palm against it and closed her eyes. Behind that wall, hidden for more than a decade, was a space not marked, not spoken of, and not blessed. If answers existed, they were in there, waiting in the dark, surrounded by silence and the weight of too many years. Marla didn't want to bring a full team in just yet. Too many people and too much noise would attract attention, and the church was already bristling with whispers. Instead, she returned with one trusted colleague, Officer Lane, someone she'd worked with on sensitive scenes before. He carried a small bag of tools, nothing dramatic, just what they needed to open a piece of wall without drawing too much notice from the staff upstairs. The section they targeted was in the far corner of the basement, behind a row of rusted folding chairs and stacked boxes of outdated curriculum. Marla moved the items aside slowly, hands brushing against years of settled dust. The wall in question had been patched with drywall that didn't quite match the surrounding concrete. It looked like someone had done the job quickly, and with little concern for consistency. Lane tapped lightly along the surface, listening for shifts in sound. When he found the hollow spot, he looked at Marla, then began scoring a clean line across the drywall with his utility knife. The moment the panel gave way, a stale breath of air escaped from the void behind it. It smelled of damp wood, old fabric, and something else, something sour that clung to the back of Marla's throat. She pulled out her flashlight and aimed the beam into the dark space. It wasn't large, maybe 6 feet by 8, with low ceilings and unfinished walls. The floor was dirt packed down hard, and in the center sat a small wooden chair with one leg splintered. Nearby, a pile of tattered blankets lay folded, too neatly to have been forgotten. On the far wall, faint scratch marks streaked the concrete, just above where a child's height would be. Marla stepped carefully inside, her foot crunching over something brittle. She looked down and saw a broken crayon, faded blue, the kind a Sunday school teacher might hand out during coloring time. Lane said nothing. He just stood at the opening, watching, as if the room might speak on its own. No remains, no blood, no smoking gun, but it was a room that was never meant to be found, and someone had once made sure it stayed that way. Marla backed out slowly, her heart pounding with the quiet knowledge that this was no longer just a missing person case. It never had been. By the time the sun dipped behind the steeple, the small basement room had been carefully sealed off with police tape. Marla stood outside the opening, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the shadows inside. Forensics would come in the morning to collect samples, scan surfaces, and determine if anything more could be lifted from the decades-old scene. But she already knew what the space had been. It wasn't just forgotten storage. It was a place someone had used, a place someone had built or modified with a purpose, and not a good one. She spent the evening flipping through the old church directories, trying to match names to faces, to positions of access and authority. That summer in 1981 had been a busy one, filled with building upgrades and staffing shifts. One name continued to surface again and again in the maintenance logs: Arnold Halbrook. Not just the Reverend, but also head of the Facilities Committee that year. Every repair, every door key, every budget line for locks and construction had passed through his hands. Marla pulled his personnel file from the archive box. It was thin, barely a few pages. His resignation letter was polite, dated October 1981, citing health and a need to care for his ailing mother in Florida. There were no formal complaints, no references to tension or scandal, but the timing struck her. He'd left less than 4 months after Tommy disappeared. She checked the minutes from that fall's board meetings. One motion passed quietly with no public discussion: approval to close and seal off unused basement storage to reduce liability risks. The pieces weren't forming a full picture yet, but they were starting to point in one direction. Marla circled Halbrook's name and jotted a note beside it: interview necessary, possibly evasive. She would need to track down his current address, and if he was still alive, sit down with him face to face. People didn't hide children's drawings and small shoes in plastic bins unless they were trying to erase something, and people didn't wall off church basements unless they had something to hide behind the drywall. She gathered her notes and headed for the door, casting one last look at the dark corner of the church where the air still hung heavy. Tommy Wilkes had been in that space, maybe not alive, maybe not for long, but he had been there, and now the walls were finally beginning to speak. The forensics team arrived at dawn, their gear clinking softly as they descended into the basement with slow, deliberate steps. Marla watched from the side, arms folded, notebook in hand, as they scanned the hidden room for trace evidence. They moved with the quiet reverence of people working inside a memory, careful not to disturb more than they had to. One of them knelt beside the small wooden chair, brushing away years of settled dust to reveal faint fingerprints on the backrest. Another collected fibers from the pile of blankets, each thread bagged and labeled, no matter how degraded. Every inch of the room was treated like sacred ground, because in a way, it was. Marla stepped aside to let them work, her thoughts still circling the same name: Halbrook. The Reverend who had signed off on the sealed basement, who had comforted the town from the pulpit while locking doors downstairs. She had made a few calls the night before and confirmed he was still living Florida, as the file had said, in a modest retirement community near Tallahassee. She already had a flight booked for the next morning. Back at the station, she reviewed the evidence collected from the bin and the room: the drawing, the sneaker, a single button, rusted slightly, pulled from beneath the folded blanket. The lab was still working on the crayon and the soil samples from the floor. The scent from the room lingered in her nose, even now musty, old, and somehow sad, as if time itself had soured in the dark. She pulled up a photo from the Potluck that year, one taken by a local newspaper for the church bulletin. In the background, you could just make out Tommy, plate in hand, grinning at something out of frame. Behind him, Halbrook stood with one hand resting on the railing of the back steps, his face turned slightly, eyes watching the children near the edge of the woods. Marla stared at that image for a long time, not because it was proof, not because it showed intent, but because it confirmed one thing with brutal clarity. The man in that photo was not just a bystander. He had seen Tommy that day, and now, more than a decade later, the time had come to ask him what he saw next. The air in the retirement home was heavy with disinfectant, and the quiet hum of televisions turned too low to understand. Marla signed in at the front desk and followed a nurse down a pastel hallway lined with framed watercolor prints and soft carpet that muffled every step. Reverend Arnold Halbrook's room was at the end, near a window that overlooked a parking lot lined with tired palm trees. He was sitting upright in a recliner, a blanket folded neatly across his lap, a book open but unread in his hands. He didn't look surprised to see her. If anything, his eyes registered something closer to recognition, as if he had been waiting, maybe not for her specifically, but for someone like her to arrive one day. Marla introduced herself and took a seat across from him, flipping open her notepad but not writing anything yet. She asked about McKinley Baptist, about his time there, about the summer of 1981. Halbrook answered in generalities at first. Nice congregation, strong community. He mentioned the potluck with a hollow smile, saying it had been one of the better turnouts that year. When she brought up Tommy Wilkes, his smile faded. His eyes drifted to the window, distant and glassy. He said he remembered the name, said it was a tragedy, said it haunted everyone. Marla pressed further, asking why the church basement had been sealed, why no one searched it fully, why the construction records were vague and the access logs incomplete. Halbrook didn't respond immediately. His fingers tightened slightly on the edge of his blanket, and he looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He said he hadn't been the only one with a key, that the church board had made decisions without documenting everything, that after Tommy disappeared, there had been panic, confusion, and fear of what it might mean for the church's reputation. His words were slow, careful, wrapped in the kind of rehearsed remorse that sounded like it had been used before. Marla asked if he had ever entered the basement after that day. His mouth twitched just slightly, and he said, "Not alone." It wasn't a denial. It wasn't much of an answer either. But in that pause, in the shift of his voice, she felt that something had been buried deep, and the surface was finally starting to crack. Back in McKinley, the air had started to shift. The whispers around town grew louder, passing through coffee shops and gas station counters like rumors with weight behind them. People began asking questions again, not just about Tommy Wilkes, but about the church, the leaders, and the choices made in the weeks that followed his disappearance. Most of those who had held power in 1981 were retired, relocated, or long gone. But their names lingered in board minutes and donation logs, and some of their children still lived in town, wearing those last names like silent burdens. Marla returned to the station with her recorder full of Halbrook's halting answers. She spent the evening cross-referencing everything he'd said with what little remained in the official record. His deflections were subtle but pointed. He'd admitted to being in the basement, not alone. She pulled up the old personnel list from that summer and highlighted two other names tied to building access, Wesley Marston and Roger Tate, both deacons at the time, both involved in the church's facilities oversight. Neither had ever been formally questioned. Their names appeared only in background notes, mentioned in passing in one of the volunteer interviews, never directly tied to any decisions. She dug deeper. Wesley had moved to Savannah in 1985 and passed away in 1989, but Roger was still alive, living just an hour north in a small farmhouse with no listed phone number. The next morning, she drove out there, following winding country roads until the GPS gave out and she had to rely on printed directions and memory. Roger answered the door with a cautious look. He was in his late 70s, tall and stooped, wearing a denim work shirt stained with paint. He didn't invite her in, but he didn't turn her away either. When she asked if he remembered the church basement being sealed, he hesitated, glanced over his shoulder, then stepped outside onto the porch. He said he didn't want to talk about it. Said he didn't have anything to offer. But as Marla began to walk back toward her car, he called out softly, asking if she'd found the bin. When she nodded, he looked down at the boards beneath his feet and said, "I told them we should have burned it." His voice cracked. But Halbrook said hiding it was safer. He turned and went back inside, leaving the door open just a few inches, like he wasn't ready to shut it all the way. The quote echoed in Marla's mind for the rest of the drive back. "I told them we should have burned it." It wasn't a statement about trash or clutter. It was about evidence, about guilt, and about the choice to bury a secret rather than let it burn in the light of day. The more she unraveled, the more the decisions of those weeks in 1981 took shape. They hadn't simply made mistakes, they had deliberately hidden things, erased them, and expected time to seal it all shut. Back at the station, she typed up her report and flagged it for the district attorney's office. Halbrook's statement was vague, but Roger Tate's comment was something else. It wasn't a confession, not legally, but it was the first sign of fracture from inside that tightly wound circle. Enough to widen the scope of the investigation, enough to ask more direct questions. She returned to the church later that afternoon, this time alone, drawn again to the basement, like it still held something she'd missed. She stood in the hidden room, flashlight skimming along the scratched concrete and the now empty chair. One of the forensic techs had dusted the floor again earlier that morning and found a hair snagged in a splinter of wood. It was being analyzed now, but Marla didn't need a lab report to feel the truth of what had happened here. She sat on the edge of a box and thought about Tommy, 8 years old, full of life, giggling through church games and asking for second helpings of banana pudding. He hadn't run, he hadn't gotten lost. He'd been taken. Maybe lured, maybe silenced when he saw something he wasn't supposed to. Whatever the reason, this room had been his last known space. And someone in that church had made sure no one would find it until now. She rose slowly, dusted her hands off, and closed the tape behind her. Upstairs, voices echoed faintly through the sanctuary. Choir practice had resumed, hymns floating lightly into the halls as if nothing had ever happened beneath their feet. But Marla knew better. The sound of singing didn't erase the past, it only masked it. And that mask was beginning to slip. The lab results came in 2 days later, slipped into Marla's inbox with little fanfare. The sneaker had no viable DNA left to extract, too degraded after 11 years in storage. But the hair found in the wall splinter had preserved just enough. It belonged to a child, male, consistent with Tommy Wilkes. The words on the page blurred slightly as she read them twice, then a third time, the clinical language wrapping around something raw in her chest. He had been there, not rumored, not imagined, not guessed at. He had been in that room, likely frightened, possibly injured, and then gone. She sent the file to the DA's office, along with a formal request to begin preparing a case. Halbrook and Tate might not have committed the act themselves, but obstruction, concealment, and destruction of evidence carried weight, especially when it involved the disappearance of a child. The burden of proof wouldn't rest on hearsay anymore. Now there was physical evidence to match the silence that had hung over that building for more than a decade. That evening, Marla drove out to Carol's house. She didn't want her to hear it from a reporter or a neighbor with half the facts. The porch light was already on when she arrived. Carol opened the door slowly, her eyes tired but steady. She let Marla in without a word and led her to the kitchen table where 2 mugs sat waiting, one already filled with tea. Marla laid the report gently on the table. She explained the findings in careful, measured words, not rushing, not softening. Carol listened in silence, her gaze never leaving the edge of the paper. When Marla finished, Carol reached forward and rested her hand over the report, her thumb brushing the margin. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. "I knew he didn't run off," she said. "I told them. I told everyone." She looked up. "I just never thought someone would finally listen long enough to prove it." Marla stayed a while longer, mostly in silence. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with the soft rustle of fall arriving early. Inside, the weight of truth settled into the walls like something that had always belonged there, something that had finally found its way home. The grand jury convened in early November, behind closed doors and guarded by decades of silence, finally breaking open. Marla submitted every detail. She had photos of the hidden room, lab reports confirming Tommy's DNA, transcripts from the interviews with Halbrook and Tate, copies of church records showing who had access, who made the decisions, and who looked the other way. The DA's office moved quickly once the physical evidence was in place. The case wasn't just about a missing child anymore. It was about what happened afterward, how the truth had been buried under drywall and locked doors, and the quiet complicity of men who chose reputation over justice. The indictment came down on a chilly Thursday morning. 2 counts of obstruction of justice, 1 count of destruction of evidence, one count of conspiracy to interfere with a criminal investigation. Arnold Halbrook was arrested at his assisted living facility and placed under medical supervision while awaiting transport. Roger Tate was picked up at his farmhouse without incident. Neither man resisted. In fact, according to the arresting deputy, Tate looked almost relieved when they knocked. News of the arrest swept through McKinley like a long-forgotten wind. For some, it stirred guilt. For others, vindication. Church members who had once avoided eye contact with Carol Wilkes now stopped her in grocery store aisles, unsure of what to say but feeling they should say something. She didn't answer most of them. She didn't owe them that. Marla watched it all unfold with the quiet steadiness of someone who had long understood how slow justice could move. She knew a conviction wouldn't undo the loss. It wouldn't restore the years stolen or the ache left behind. But it mattered. It marked a shift. It brought accountability to people who had hidden behind pulpits and closed doors. And it sent a message to anyone still holding secrets that the truth had ways of surfacing even after 11 years. That night, she returned to the basement one final time. The room was empty now, fully processed, no longer sealed in silence. She stood at the edge of where the wall had been, flashlight off, and let the dark speak for itself. There were no more shadows to chase. Only the knowledge that Tommy Wilkes had not been forgotten, and finally, someone had listened. The trial was scheduled for early spring, but as winter settled in over Georgia, the courthouse grew busier with pretrial motions and quiet negotiations behind closed doors. Halbrook's attorney pushed for a plea deal, citing the Reverend's advanced age and deteriorating health. The DA didn't flinch. They had enough to move forward, enough to prove that what happened to Tommy Wilkes had not been a case of simple neglect or accident. It had been covered up, and now the cover was finally torn away. Marla spent her days sorting through the final files, preparing summaries and cross-checking witness lists. She met with Carol often now, not just out of obligation, but because their connection had grown into something steadier and understanding, forged through grief and persistence. Carol didn't speak much about what justice meant to her. She didn't talk in terms of courtrooms or headlines, but once, during a quiet afternoon at her kitchen table, she said she just wanted it to be real. For someone to finally say out loud what she had known all along, that her son had been left in the dark and forgotten. Forensics teams had returned to the church one last time, this time with ground-penetrating radar. In the far edge of the basement wall, just behind the foundation where the dirt had shifted slightly over time, they found a shallow cavity, not large, barely a depression. Inside it, carefully wrapped in a deteriorated piece of cloth, were two more objects: a child's plastic wristwatch, the band cracked and brittle, and a small metal cross. Both had been listed among Tommy's personal belongings at the time of his disappearance, though dismissed then as likely lost during play. When Marla showed the items to Carol, she held them with shaking hands. She didn't cry. She just sat still, tracing the face of the watch with her thumb, as if she could feel time restarting in her hands. The case was no longer about speculation. It was rooted in tangible things now: drawings, footprints, fabric, hair, and each piece stitched together a story that had been silenced far too long. As Marla looked out across the church lawn one evening, frost dusting the grass where children once played, she realized this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of telling the truth in full. Word of the newly discovered objects traveled quickly, making the front page of the McKinley Gazette for the first time in years. The headline was quiet but unmistakable: "Evidence confirms presence of missing boy in sealed church room." For the townspeople, who had whispered for more than a decade, who had lowered their eyes when passing Carol in the aisles of the market, it was no longer just an old tragedy tucked into memory. It was present. It had weight. And it carried consequences. Church leadership issued a carefully worded statement the following Sunday, read aloud by the current pastor at the close of service. He acknowledged the findings and expressed sorrow for what had happened, though the tone was cautious, almost clinical. Marla attended from the back pew, not in uniform, not taking notes, just listening. When the congregation was dismissed, She watched as people filed out slowly, many pausing near the front to light a candle at the altar where a photo of Tommy had been placed beside a simple white rose. The memorial wasn't planned. It wasn't part of any official effort. It started with one person, then another, until the front of the sanctuary became quietly flooded with small offerings: a toy truck, a crumpled drawing, a folded paper airplane with his name on it, all symbols of a boy the town had once failed to protect, now finally being remembered in the open. Back at the station, Marla received a phone call from a man who had been just a teenager in 1981, now in his 40s, living out of state. He said he'd been at the potluck. He remembered seeing Tommy near the back of the church shortly before the commotion began, and more importantly, he remembered someone else, an adult, taking Tommy by the hand and leading him toward the basement entrance. He never said anything. He'd convinced himself he must have been wrong, that someone would have already known, that it couldn't have mattered. But after seeing the news, he couldn't stay quiet anymore. Marla thanked him, heart pounding. The case that had felt closed by time was still unfolding, thread by thread. It was no longer about just solving a mystery. It was about restoring every voice that had been ignored and giving Tommy the clarity his name had always deserved. The man from the phone call, Daniel Kessler, flew in 2 weeks later. He had grown into a quiet, thoughtful adult with graying temples and a voice that still carried the weight of uncertainty. Marla met him at the station, and together they walked through the events of that day as he remembered them. He wasn't dramatic, he didn't embellish. He simply recalled standing near the lemonade table when he saw Tommy trailing behind one of the deacons, Roger Tate, headed toward the rear of the church. He said he hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Adults led kids around the church all the time, but something about Tate's face, the way he looked over his shoulder after they disappeared inside, had stuck with him. Daniel had held on to that moment for years, brushing it away, pulling it back, unsure if it was real or just something his memory had stitched together in the silence. But after hearing about the room and the bin and the recovered items, he knew it had happened, and now he was ready to testify. The DA's office added Daniel to the witness list for the trial. His statement, though coming so many years later, carried weight. It placed Tommy under adult supervision. It connected the dots between access and intent. And it gave the jury someone to look at, someone whose eyes had seen a truth no one else had been willing to speak aloud until now. Marla walked him through the church that afternoon, retracing his steps from that day, letting his memory guide the path. When they reached the hallway outside the old basement door, he stopped and stared for a long time. His voice dropped as he said, "It was here. I remember the brown shoes. I remember the scrape on Tommy's knee. And I remember thinking he didn't want to go." That sentence stayed with Marla long after Daniel left. It echoed in her mind, soft but sharp. He didn't want to go, and still, no one stopped it. The weight of that moment now belonged to everyone who had let it pass unnoticed. But no longer. That testimony, fragile as it was, gave the case its final spine. And in a town once silenced by shame, it became the clearest signal yet that the truth was no longer something people were afraid to name. When the trial began, the courtroom filled with the same unease that had settled over McKinley all those years ago, only this time it had shape and voice. The gallery was packed with townspeople, some there out of obligation, others out of guilt, and a few simply needing to see the truth named aloud in a room that had once ignored it. Carol sat quietly near the front, a handkerchief folded neatly in her lap, her posture still, her expression unreadable. Roger Tate sat at the defense table, head down, eyes rarely meeting anyone else's. Halbrook was absent, declared medically unfit to stand trial, his condition too fragile for the burden of the courtroom. But his name surfaced again and again, woven into testimony, mentioned in documents, and etched into every decision that had sealed the fate of a child whose only mistake had been being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Daniel Kessler took the stand on the second day. His voice was steady as he described what he saw: the shoes, the look over the shoulder, the unease in Tommy's face. The room was silent as he spoke, no coughs or shifting feet, just the tight stillness of people hearing what they had long suspected, spoken plainly at last. The prosecutor walked the jury through every piece of the puzzle. The timeline, the hidden room, the contents of the blue Tupperware bin, the fingerprints, the recovered watch and cross. Each item was presented with clinical precision, but beneath it all pulsed a quiet ache. This wasn't just evidence, it was memory made physical. When Marla took the stand, she spoke not as a rookie like she had once been, but as the investigator who had refused to let this case stay buried. She described the feeling of standing in that secret room, of touching the wall where a child had once scratched his name or tried to. She described the silence and what it had cost. By the end of the week, the jury had heard more than enough to understand that the case was never about whether Tommy had been taken. It was about how many people had chosen not to see it. And finally, that blindness was being held to account. The verdict came in on a gray Thursday morning, the sky low and heavy as if the town itself was holding its breath. The jury filed in with the solemn weight of people who understood the gravity of what they were about to say. No one in the courtroom moved, not even to shift in their seat. Carol sat still, her hands folded, eyes locked on the foreman as he stood to speak. Guilty, on all counts. Roger Tate lowered his head, his shoulders collapsing slightly under the words. There was no outburst, no gasps, only the quiet hum of resolution settling into the room like dust after a long storm. The charges weren't for murder. They never could be, not with time, not without a body, but obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, and conspiracy carried sentences long enough to matter. Long enough for the town to feel the weight of accountability pressing into its history. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered for the first time in years, notebooks in hand, cameras ready to capture the image of justice, finally catching up to a story that had once vanished without a trace. Marla stayed back, letting the moment belong to Carol. She watched as Carol stepped out, paused beneath the overcast sky, and looked toward the horizon, like she was seeing it with new eyes. There were no prepared statements, no dramatic speeches. Just a mother standing quietly in a town that had once failed her, and now, in its imperfect way, had tried to make that right. People approached her one by one, offering small words, some apologies, some acknowledgments, most of them barely above a whisper. She nodded politely, but she didn't linger. That evening, Marla returned to the church one last time, not to investigate but to listen. The sanctuary was empty, the lights dimmed, the air still. The small memorial at the front remained, now permanent, framed and protected by glass. A photo of Tommy, a copy of the crayon drawing, and a plaque that read, "In memory of the voice we lost and the voices we chose not to hear, may we never turn away again." It wasn't justice in its purest form, but it was truth, spoken without fear, and in McKinley, that finally meant something. In the weeks that followed the verdict, McKinley began to shift in ways both subtle and deep. The church board voted unanimously to establish a fund in Tommy Wilkes's name, one dedicated to child advocacy and community safety initiatives. It wasn't grand, and it couldn't change the past, but it was a step, a way of acknowledging that silence had once been louder than truth and that something had to exist in its place now. Carol attended the dedication quietly. She didn't speak. She didn't want to. The sight of the plaque with Tommy's name carved clean into the stone was enough. People gave her space. She stood at the edge of the gathering, one hand resting gently on the metal railing near the church garden, eyes on the small bed of marigolds planted beneath the memorial. Yellow had been his favorite color, not because it was bright, but because, as he once told her, it looked like the sun when it smiled. Marla watched from a few steps away, letting the moment belong to the woman who had lived through all of it. She thought back to the first time she had walked through the church basement, flashlight in hand, unsure of what she'd find but certain that something had been left behind. Now, every corner of that building had been touched, searched, reopened. The locked doors were gone, the hidden room dismantled. What once lived in shadow had been dragged, piece by piece, into daylight. The town didn't speak of Tommy with pity anymore. His name no longer lived in whispers. Children knew it now, not as a mystery, but as a reason their Sunday school doors stayed open and checked. As a reason no adult could lead a child anywhere on church grounds without someone else present. It was his story that made those rules. As spring crept in and the garden began to bloom, the memorial took on a quiet permanence. Visitors came less out of curiosity and more out of respect. People no longer looked away when they passed Carol at the store. Some still didn't know what to say, but at least now they tried. And in a town that once chose to forget, remembering had finally become the only thing that mattered. Marla didn't expect to feel anything when she packed up the last of the files. The case had been part of her life for so long that she thought closure would come as a kind of finality, a clean break between before and after. But instead, it felt like placing a photograph into an album not forgotten, just stored with care. She slid the folder into the records box, closed the lid, and sat quietly for a moment, letting the weight of it settle. The Wilkes case had changed her. Not just professionally, though it had made her sharper, more patient, more attuned to the spaces between official stories. But personally, it had reconnected her to why she'd joined the force in the first place. Not for courtroom victories or headlines, but to give voice to those who had been ignored, to listen where others had chosen silence. Before leaving, she made one final stop at the evidence room. The blue plastic Tupperware bin was still there, cataloged and sealed, its contents now fully photographed and preserved. It would never be thrown away. It had become part of the permanent archive, a symbol of what had once been missed and what had finally been uncovered. She stared at it for a long time, remembering the moment it was first opened. How something so ordinary had carried so much. A child's drawing, a single shoe, a truth buried beneath years of dust and denial. Outside, the sky was pale with early spring light, and the trees along the courthouse lawn were beginning to bud. As she walked across the square, Marla passed the bakery where Carol had once worked part-time and saw a hand-drawn sign in the window that read, "Tommy Day Free Cookies for Kids this Saturday." It was written in bright marker, surrounded by stars and suns, the kind of thing an 8-year-old might have designed. She smiled, just slightly, and kept walking. The town wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it had faced its past. It had opened the bin. And now, every child who ran across the church lawn, every parent who looked twice, every teacher who asked more questions, they were part of what came next. And that mattered more than anything. The anniversary came quietly, just like it always had. But this year, something was different. The church didn't ignore it. The town didn't look away. There were no dramatic ceremonies, no reporters with cameras, just a small gathering beneath the oak tree beside the church where Tommy had last been seen chasing laughter through the grass. Carol arrived early, holding a simple bouquet of yellow daisies, and placed them at the foot of the new bench installed beneath the tree. On a small bronze plaque affixed to the wood, the inscription read, "For Tommy Wilkes, whose light still teaches us to see." A few families joined her, some who remembered him, some who never knew him but brought their children to sit and listen anyway. They told stories, not about what was lost, but about what had changed. Safer buildings, stricter rules, a church that finally checked every room, a community that finally understood that silence was never an option again. Marla stood a little farther back, hands in her pockets, watching the scene unfold. She didn't need to be in the center. Her work was finished, but her presence still mattered. She caught Carol's eye for a brief moment, and they exchanged a small nod. Not of triumph, not even relief, just recognition of what they had carried, of what they had built from the pieces. The blue plastic Tupperware bin now sat in a museum display at the County Historical Center. Not tucked away, not hidden. Front and center in an exhibit titled, "When the Truth Came Back." Inside the clear case, the bin was surrounded by carefully labeled artifacts, the child's drawing, the watch, The blanket thread, a copy of the blueprint showing the sealed room. School groups visited often. Some children pointed. Some looked away, but all of them learned. Tommy Wilkes never made it past 8 years old, but he changed things, not just in McKinley, but beyond. His story had rippled through halls and homes, through courtrooms and classrooms, and left behind a message more powerful than anything sealed in silence, that even the smallest voice, once heard, could shake the walls, and that the truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way out.